Right, so we're continuing in Unit 4 on environmental legacies and legislation. And so just a quick review of what we've gone over already. We talked about some of the US environmental policies, starting with the River and Harbors Act in 1899, which is the first time where dumping into waterways was actually legislated. Then that was followed up about 50 years later with the Water Pollution Act. And then it was really strengthened into what we understand now as the Clean Water Act of 1972, which has been updated several times. Now, the Clean Water Act sets water quality standards, like the water has to be this clean. It assesses water quality. Is the water that clean? It issues discharge permits, meaning they'll work with industry and municipalities going, okay, well, here's your discharge permit, but you're going to have to keep your discharge into waterways, below this level in order to maintain ecological integrity. And so the Clean Water Act affects our sewer systems, right? We have municipal sewers, and so the Clean Water Act directly affects our local communities and how they process wastewater. And then finally, the EPA has an enforcement arm where they can find and prosecute people and organizations that break the rules within the Clean Water Act. And again, enforcement has dropped precipitously in the last 4 years. And so this, if you take this out, if you're not enforcing the limits, what incentive is there for corporations to follow the spirit of their permits? Right? I know I'm not going to get pulled over for going 5 miles over the speed limit. We can chop that up a bit to white privilege, but also I'm not breaking the law that bad. But I don't go 15 miles over the limit because I know I'm going to get caught and that's an expensive ticket. My car insurance is going to go up. And so would I drive 15 miles an hour over the speed limit if I knew there were no cops? Probably, right? It's not that I'm a bad person. It's just I want to get there quicker. And so when we're looking at the government role in oversight, it has to include some type of enforcement, particularly with environmental issues. So this is how the Clean Water Act works. We have an addendum with the Safe Drinking Water Act of 1974, and then the Near and Dear Clean Air Act and its amendments are, basically the crux of my master's and PhD research of long rain pollution. Like acid rain was the main focus of the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. And today we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, affectionately known as Superfund. So speaking about some of the rollbacks that have happened to our air quality environmental laws, I wanted to bring up the effect that air quality has on COVID. You guys heard about this? A small increase in long-term exposure to particulate matter 2.5 is to a large increase in the death rate. So let's take a look at what PM 2.5 is. Well, PM stands for particulate matter. And we've got two sizes that we measure in air quality. PM10, which is actually 10 microns or micrometers. And so 10 is generally about 1/5 of a human hair, right? So human hair is 50 to 70 millimeters thick. And so a portion of that would be measured in micrometers, right? So we've got micrometers, millimeters, centimeters, meters. And so this is just that next level down of 1/1000th of a meter. Well, you can guess from that that 2.5 is a fifth of that, right? So 2.5 microns or 2.5 micrometers is stuff that's floating in the air that's usually combustion particles, organic compounds, metals, etc. It's really small stuff that we can't see, but we're breathing in all the time. This is really associated with combustion of fossil fuels, with agriculture, with fires especially. And so the higher your long-term exposure to these particulates, the more likely you are to die of COVID. Thankfully, up here, we have really clean air quality. But when you start looking at death rates from COVID, it's much higher in areas with really poor air quality. So right now, we've got the European health agencies, European cardio, I forget the full name of it, but here's the link, has found that through October, study estimates exposure to air pollution increases COVID-19 deaths by 15% worldwide. More than 1 million people have died. 15% of them may not have if they had clean air. Meanwhile, we have, 100 environmental laws that are being rolled back. Many of them have to do with emissions and air quality. So when we look at that, New York Times article of all the things that are being rolled back, they may not feel personal. But if you live in a place that has poor air quality and you have multiple people around you dying of COVID, it becomes real personal real fast. So let's look at some environmental policy on an international scale. One of the first ones was actually the Montreal Protocol, which, if you remember, regulates CFCs in the atmosphere for, excuse me, my cat's chiming in. I don't even know where she is. What did you do? She's in the boxes. Okay, so Montreal Protocol regulated CFCs, which were found in refrigerants and propellants. And those CFCs were eating a hole in our ozone layer. Kofi Annan called it one of the most successful environmental international efforts ever. In a similar vein, we have the Stockholm Convention in 2001, which was against these persistent organic pollutants, or POPs. And I've got the list of parties that signed on to the Stockholm Convention, and you'll notice that we've got some gaps here. There's some countries that don't have the infrastructure to participate in something like this, and then we've got the United States. And so apparently we're not party to protecting human health and the environment from persistent organic pollutants. We have the Kyoto Protocol, which is really starting to look at climate change 20 years ago, right? And then more recently, we had the Paris Agreement, which was an update of the Kyoto Protocols, setting, emission standards and target emissions in order to slow down climate change. And once again, I think we've got, is that Sudan? No. Uzbekistan, some third world country, and the United States and Nicaragua are the folks that have not signed on or ratified the Paris Agreement. Now, Biden has said that he will do his best to get us back on the Paris Agreement. We'll see how that goes. All right. So we've got some really interesting dichotomies here, right? We've got some of the best air and water quality in the world. And yes, we're unwilling to participate in some of the international agreements. Something to think about and to really evaluate, well, why aren't we in the Stockholm Agreement? What was in there that wouldn't be good for the US? Well, the Superfund program was actually started in, 1980, I think? Again, Superfund is the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act. That's too much to say, and CERCLA isn't very much fun either. So Superfund is what we call this program. And it allows the EPA to come in and clean up contaminated sites. It forces the parties that were responsible for the contamination to either do the cleanup themselves or reimburse the government for the EPA-led cleanup work. Basically, EPA comes in and makes sure it's done properly and to the right specifications. And when there is no viable party, like bankruptcy or the company dissolved completely or just disappeared, Superfund gives the EPA the funds and authority to clean up the contaminated site. And so the goals of this program were first to protect human health and the environment by cleaning up legacy contamination. And it makes responsible parties pay for the cleanup work when it can. And it involves communities in the Superfund process and tries to return these areas to productive use. Well, we've got our very own Superfund site in Cass Lake that is called St. Regis. Now, this was the site of an old wood processing facility, and it's been ongoing since 1986. And so we're into the 7th or 8th 5-year review. And we're going to spend some time today talking about St. Regis and what the current state of that site is. But I want to start with the most recent update. In April, they announced a decision on how they're going to deal with the rest of the contamination on the site. Now, I kind of feel like I need to stop here and back up a little bit to give you a sense of what this means. The historic overview, and this is linked into the portal or into the Canvas module, and so you'll have access to go through this on your own. All right, so we have the St. Regis Superfund site, which is right here in Cass Lake. Right, here's the campus. Here's your railroad beds and the highway, right? We can go back and look at it in 1959. You see all the wood and the factories and whatnot, right? And we can look at this more recently as well. And it's basically a really big area with not a lot of stuff going on there. You can actually see a train in this picture. Now, Superfund operates with these operable units within a site, meaning, okay, this area is really dirty and it has to have a different treatment plan than this area over here, which maybe we're looking at groundwater infiltration over here, maybe we're looking at soil at the surface over here. And so they divide it up into these OUs, or operatable units. And so OU1 is the entire commercially zoned area that was part of the original businesses that were causing the contamination. OU2 is a vault that was built as part of the remediation. OU3 is a city dump, and OU7 are areas with really contaminated soil and dust. Out. Get out. All the pets are annoying me today. Okay, so what was the source of the contamination? Well, it was a wood treatment facility. And so they were using creosote and PCBs and whatnot to dry and treat wood. And they had wastewater from this process, and it was being stored in shallow, unlined ponds on site. They actually then used that wastewater to spray for dust suppression on the site. And not only do they have contaminated water that is sinking down into the groundwater, they're then using what hasn't infiltrated to spray the rest of the area. So they're actually spreading this contamination around to keep the dust down. They brought some of the wastewater and sludge to the city dump where it was burned and stored in pits. It's not a good way of getting rid of things. And then wastewater was disposed of in the former city water treatment plant, which was discharged into Fox Creek. So Fox Creek is this little beauty right down here. We've actually done some frog surveys through this area. And again, we're looking at it being really close to part of the Superfund area. There was on-site spills, there was burning of wood scraps in these teepee burners. We'll take a look at those. And they dried treated wood across the site with wastewater draining into the soil. And these drying areas are the red circles. The yellow circle back here shows that no vegetation could even grow there when the chemicals were dumped, right? And this was never really cleaned up. So contamination source on the teepee burners, they've actually got a picture of one here where they would treat these logs like telephone poles, right? So they've got the creosote and PCBs and PAH, which is polyaromatic hydrocarbons and dioxins. Well, they would cut off the ends of the telephone pole that had split and just burn them to get rid of them. Well, they had these shallow ponds with contaminated water. The sources were all over the place in this area. And it was in 1984, 25 years after the major portion of this contamination was formed, that it was added to the national priority lists, which then declared it a Superfund site. And by 1986, cleanup was ordered. So it's now 2020. So we have 34 years of cleanup at this site. Now, thankfully, it doesn't quite look like this anymore, but there's still contaminated groundwater plumes, particularly here along Fox Creek and this area that goes into Pike Bay. A lot of that water is now collected and put through a filter. And so they've got wells across here that intersect the groundwater flow, and they pump that water out into a treatment plant and then let it go after that. And so that was the main idea for cleaning up the groundwater as well. We're not going to let it seep into Pike Bay if we can avoid it. And so instead it's brought into charcoal and other isomers in a filter to clean out the offending chemicals. Another thing that happened with this is they extended city water. Now, I've talked to folks who grew up right in this neighborhood, whose parents did, or not, and I keep hearing stories about their dogs would die, and there was some really strange cancers in the area. And so there really does seem like there were issues with the water and with the air that really affected people's health. Now, many of the houses through here have been removed, right? There used to be a neighborhood here, and it was just, there's too much dust and toxicity from the site to live there. So the preliminary cleanup put a lot of the really, really dirty stuff in this landfill. There's the word I'm looking for, behind DRM. So right here is DRM. I don't know if you guys have been out there, but Right behind there is a landfill with most of the dirtiest material from the site. Well, when they did this, they only used a single layer and it wasn't up to modern standards. And so what they're finding now is that this is already leaking. And so in 1995, so about 10 years after it was slated for cleanup, the EPA comes in part because the band wasn't happy with how the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency was handling the site. And as a sovereign nation, the state of Minnesota did not have jurisdiction to lead the cleanup within the bounds of Beach Lake and Ojibwe. So this site keeps going through the historic overview. And one of the cool things that the band decided to do about 20 years ago was to sign on to the Hazardous Substance Control Act, which set rigorous limits on the amount of these substances that were okay to have in soil or in water. And so by 2001, they sampled all the way across. So each one of these little purple dots or pink circles was a soil sample that actually contained more dioxin, more PAHs, and more PCPs than the Hazardous Substance Control Act would allow. And so we can actually click on individual dots. This sample had 3,000 parts per trillion of dioxin. The level considered safe is 10 parts per trillion, right? So this one's closer. So they've done some cleanup up here, but here at the edge of the landfill, you're seeing much higher areas, right? 3,000 parts per trillion, that's a lot. Again, it tested in 2003. And we start seeing some difference there, but the map's taking some time to load. Actually started sampling on the other side of the tracks and found that there is cause for concern on that side, twice as much on this side as is allowable. And again, we're still seeing 1,000 parts per trillion down here. So basically the band has stepped in saying, you guys aren't doing enough. You've moved soil, but you haven't fixed the problem. So in 2004, the Minnesota Department of Health finally declared St. Regis a public health hazard due to the amount of contamination that was still on site. And dioxins, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, and PCPs. What's that one again? Pentachlorophenol are the main contaminants that are found at this site. The dust suppression was an issue, so they started sampling people's houses, and the dust in people's houses had toxic amounts of these materials in it. You can read through more carefully on this. There's also a lunch and learn from last April. Actually, I think it was February, from our tribal college, but the audio quality of that video isn't very good. So you can watch that and see the environmental director, Ben Benoit, step through the site as well. And of course, he knows it much better than I do. So again, there's still sampling going on, although 2013-14 was the last one it was done. I think that they are gearing up for another round. It was supposed to happen this past summer, but with COVID, I think some of those plans got pushed off. Now there's further tabs here. This idea of environmental justice, that the site hasn't been fully characterized, that it's taken way too long for EPA to actually do anything about the site, and that the decreased budgets have meant that some of the remediation options haven't been fully funded. Well, this particular story map was put together summer of 19, and they had a proposed cleanup plan where you could actually do a public comment. However, this was closed. And here's where we get back to the PowerPoint, where in April, they selected one of those treatment plans and said, we're going to spend $21 million to clean up this site. Unfortunately, it still leaves a lot of contaminated soil on site. And the Leech Lake Band really questioned the timing of the announcement amid the pandemic, while the tribal government is closed, and vows to fight the decision in court. So I've included the link to the press release, the site website on EPA, the story map, the public health statement here. This is the Leech Lake News article where Fern Jackson said, we can only assume the timing of the EPA announcement is to mask the shame the EPA is feeling as this pandemic limits both the community and the band's ability to respond. This record of decision undermines the fair application of law, community input, and sets the stage to unjustly shift the burden of contamination and cleanup from the responsible parties to the tribe. And so we also have another website here on Division of Resource Management's site about the cleanup and the enforcement and the plans and so on. And I think this is a really good summary of what's going on. Now, another source of information are the 5-year plans. And I've uploaded the most recent one, the 2021, which was put out in July. Now, I don't recommend reading the whole thing. It's 139 pages. But you can start paging through this a bit and see what's interesting. One of my favorite parts is the list of abbreviations and acronyms, which they started putting in the more recent files because there's just so many of them, right? And here are some of those that I've highlighted that are relevant to the current cleanup efforts. This is the 6th fifth-year report, and it's been prepared due to the fact that hazardous substances remain at the site that doesn't allow for unlimited use or unrestricted exposure. And so here we've got those operatable units listed again. And notice that the Fox Creek Valley groundwater plume has been added to this list compared to what the ArcGIS map said. So this is a rather thick report, but you can go through and look at the tables, look at some of the highlights, and still get a lot of information without actually having to read the whole thing. Like when I was going through, I wanted to see the history of actions that have been taken. And right here on page 10, we've got it. But they started by removing nearly 4,000 tons of soil from the site, most of which is stored down near Buffalo, Minnesota, which, great. So we've just moved the problem to someone else's groundwater. But I think that's a more up-to-date landfill than what we've got here. So these reports are put out every 5 years from EPA's perspective. They're really quite dense to read. I find them interesting, but I can't sit and read through the whole thing. Now, meanwhile, they did put out this, which I put up on the portal. What's in Water? It's the community newsletter. And it's from a perspective of we're doing our job. Here's what it's going to mean for you who live in the area. I'd like you to compare this to the other data sources that we've got. And so I put that in the latest assignment, which I've got to after Thanksgiving. I figure you've got enough to really get your final project going that you didn't need to have another quiz due this weekend. And so, assignments. Here's the week 13. And so I want you to go back and look at that story now, that Woods and Water community newsletter, that 2020 press release that says, hey, we decided to spend $21 million. And a response, which is like, you guys still ain't fixing it. Because there's much more data and links available in the module. But what I want you to do is look through this information, take some notes, and evaluate and respond to the info by providing a summary of what's going on there now and what future action might be needed to actually remedy the area. It'll take you 2 or 3 paragraphs. I'm not asking for formal citations, but if you choose something besides these 4, which you probably will, provide a link. Okay. So this is just your opportunity to explore the St. Regis site with some of the information I've curated. And you can find that here in week 3. Right, so there's a story map.